Welcome. I'm Andy Thorburn from Contemporary Policy Institute. Welcome to CPI Perspectives. Today's topic is ethnic studies, and we're very pleased and honored to have with us as a guest to talk about ethnic studies, Dr. Natalie Graham. First, Natalie, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Of course, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, I have to ask you though, if all the activities that you have, how you juggle your time, because you are a poet, and in fact, the former poet laureate of Orange County.
That's right.
You're a professor, so you're a professor of African American Studies, and you're also the interim associate dean at Fullerton in the College of Humanities.
That's right.
So how do you juggle all those roles?
You know, I do things that I love. You know, it's really important to me to be involved in the community I'm in. It's a huge honor to be a poet laureate. I think of it as a civic duty as an artist to be able to bring art, creative writing to our communities and help people understand it. And same for Fullerton. I know Cal State Fullerton is really thinking more about how we can be vital and present to folks right here. You know?
Well, we certainly appreciate your fitting into that schedule, a session with us to talk about ethnic studies.
Sure.
And let's first begin. Let me just give some background about the ethnic studies mandate.
Yeah.
So the California State Legislature has passed a law which mandates that beginning in the 25-26 academic year, every school system in California, public schools and charter schools, have to begin to teach ethnic studies. Now, also we should point out that there is a sample curriculum that school districts can use. You don't have to use it. You can develop your own curriculum. And in fact, school districts are encouraged to develop a curriculum that reflects their particular ethnic mix.
Sure.
But if a school district doesn't have the resources or interest, they can use the state developed sample curriculum. So let's start, since you're an academic expert in this area, what do you think about ethnic studies? What do you think it means? What's your take on it?
Yeah, so the first thing I think of, I wanted to just share a little bit from this poem that I always think about in these conversations about ethnic studies and really American studies, cultural studies, understanding each other specifically in relationship to race. And so Langston Hughes has a very famous poem called I Too, and it begins with this line, I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and grow strong because one day, it says I'll be at the table when company comes and nobody will dare send me to eat in the kitchen. And the end to me is such a beautiful sort of wrapping together of what I envision ethnic studies to be. And Langston writes, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. And so a lot of times when we think about ethnic studies, we think about struggle and sort of oppositional, fighting for rights, this like kind of, conflict between racial identities and cultures. And I think that even like in the early, 20th century, Langston Hughes was really trying to grapple with this idea that his go-to writer is Walt Whitman. So you think about this writer, Langston Hughes, which is kind of brought up every Black History Month and is kind of maybe the one Black author that children might encounter in elementary school because he has these short kind of accessible poems. And he's looking at Walt Whitman, and he's looking at and not seeing himself as like not part of this literary lineage.
And we should point out actually that the first line that it's a beautiful way to start. Thank you for starting that way. It's really quite beautiful. But we should point out, as a former English teacher, I have to point out that in fact the first line that you read is a direct reference, of course, to Walt Whitman.
Right? Exactly.
So I'm responding to Walt Whitman directly.
Yes.
He started his poem, I Sing of America.
Yes, and he is, and Langston Hughes is very clear about that. He writes about being, in lineage and in conversation with Walt Whitman. He directly talks about other, and responds in other ways to Walt Whitman. And so I think that's really, the first thing I think about in ethnic studies is really culture and interconnectedness. We can't understand the development of any American cultural form, whether it's poetry or narrative storytelling, or especially music, without considering the racial dynamics in the US. And I think that ethnic studies really asks us to think about ourselves as a nation. Like, what does it mean to be part of this nation, coming from all of these different places? And so, I think about, when I teach African American music appreciation, we talk about Elvis. We spend 2 weeks on Elvis, because how can you understand rock music without understanding Elvis? And how can you understand Elvis without understanding the Black musicians that he was modeling, and for a lot of his hits, covering their songs?
Well, I can add to that an interesting story that I just learned. But most people know the famous Dvorak Symphony from the New World, in which he uses one of the famous songs from African culture. Well, it turns out that the reason he did that is when he came to America, he fell into mentorship with a Black American composer.
That's right.
Who is not well known today.
Right.
But he took Dvorak around to hear local music in Baltimore, actually.
Yeah.
And from that came this now world famous symphony that uses the theme of going home as one of the beautiful parts of the symphony. So there's more examples of what you're speaking of.
Right, and Dvorak talked a lot about, and I think it's Harry Burleigh. He talked a lot about both native, music making and African work songs and traditions. In that, he's trying to figure out what is American music. And, America at that time, they're trying to look back to Europe and say, okay, we want to be like, that's going to be our musical heritage and lineage. And really, it's jazz. When people sort of, uniformly now sort of look back on jazz music and say, well, this is really, one of the first pure American, music forms. And that's all. It's not just like one race in isolation. It absolutely comes out of the intersection between European musical forms and the music that Africans brought to the U.S., the polyrhythmic and this intersection of sacred and secular music. So I think that interconnected cultural issue is really a key element of how I understand ethnic studies.
And that brings us to the point that in terms of the role and the need for ethnic studies, obviously one of the roles is to address this past neglect. That would be one of the key goals, and I'm sure you covered a lot of that in your academic classes.
Sure.
But let's talk also about the fact that in addition to covering up this neglect that we're trying to have a corrective action for, that also it kind of gives us a new perspective on our own history.
Right. Yeah, and so I think part of what I also am really interested in, so it's we talk about culture, you talk about how do these national systems come to be and how do they work? So part of what ethnic studies is doing is trying to understand racism. How is something like racism, which feels very personal and intentional, how is it possible that could be embedded in national systems like education or law or American government, right? And so we want to think about all of those things that can possibly happen.
And that new perspective also includes probably one of the biggest needs of all is the idea of accuracy in history and completeness in history. So we should talk a little bit about how incomplete history is without some form of ethnic studies.
Right. Yeah. And so I think, for instance, one of the things that we talk about is how recent the past is. Right. So a lot of people think of the past as something that's very, very far away. Right. But once we start to look at the past, we have all of these moments that feel very directly tied to race, and they can tell us something about the current, our current culture. For instance, redlining. So we have this, federal housing administration program that's supporting and backing and insuring houses because of part of this New Deal, which we sort of uniformly say was a good program for our country. And they specifically refuse to back houses in Black neighborhoods. Right. So, and this is it's the past, but it's my parents' generation.
Correct.
So my parents would not be allowed to buy houses in these neighborhoods that were backed by, this huge influx of federal government money. And all of these junctures in American history, you find the reality is there was a racial component. And I think that if we think about American history as something where we can take race out and just talk about the past without really talking about race, we find ourselves tripping again and again over the law itself. We find ourselves tripping again and again over the statutes that were written that included race. Somebody like, our Chief Justices, the famous Dred Scott decision, where you have a Chief Justice who says, there is no law that a white man is bound to respect, that a black man could have. And so these ideas of like this sort of woven in, embedded in our history, the particular reference to race. So it's really impossible to understand these foundational moments of history and then like what the thread is to today without understanding comprehensively racial dynamics.
Another way to say it is that we've always taught ethnic history,
right,
but we just limited the ethnic groups we decided to talk about.
Yeah.
And I have a sort of personal anecdote about it that, I lived in New Jersey for quite a while, and my kids started school in New Jersey. And when we moved to California, they were in, I think, 8th and 9th grade.
Right.
And they brought home their geography book, social studies book, and instead of being about primarily the Pilgrims and Massachusetts and all, it was all about the Spanish missions. And I looked at this book and I said to my kids, what kind of history lesson is this? It was totally new to me.
Right.
So here, just within two different coasts of the country, still not anywhere near inclusive, but how different a perspective can be from an ethnic point of view just by traveling within the United States.
Right. And so, I'm born and raised in Florida, so we had to know about St. Augustine and the conquistadors and like all of the early, settlers to Florida as well. And so I think like thinking more about the vitality and the way to make a comprehensive understanding of our past as part of as ethnic studies mission, not just as a sort of corrective to add something on top of, but to really, in some ways, talk about like what's behind and what's underneath the history that we already are learning and have.
Exactly. Well, let's turn back, though, to the state mandate.
Sure.
I think we've sort of given some background as to the need for it and the role that ethnic studies would play in education. But, the mandate has what they would call 4 key themes that are identified in the statute that they want school districts to address. And the first one is what they call identity. So let's talk about that first, what the mandate means and what your approach to identity would be.
I think that one of the important things about identity is making it sort of transparent and making it part of how students construct themselves in a world, right? So understanding racial identity, just like gender identity, just like class identity, and how we are perceived and how we perceive ourselves and how others perceive us, that's a historical, character. That's a historical quality. Like I know that we are very much independent individual, in the U.S. That's part of our, ethos. But also we are embedded in a historical understanding of culture and place. And so if we think about like, how do I understand myself in this place, in this moment, without understanding something like the Great Migration, the fact that, Black folks moved from being primarily in the South, to being primarily in the cities in the North and the West. And so that was a huge demographic shift that impacted the way, what the cultural norms are. So why I might like a particular food, why I might like a particular weather or music or sound.
Music that you mentioned before.
Yeah, that has to do with my identity. And I think that there's so many facets of identity. So religion is another facet of identity. So it'd be like saying, who you are doesn't have anything to do with what religion you believe or don't believe in, which we know like is patently false, like is on the face of it. Right. And identity is the same. Racial identity is the same. Ethnic identity is the same. It's not possible to really ignore those parts of who we are and understand ourselves and our role in community. So I think that's part of it. Really, identity? That communal aspect of saying who I am is in relationship to you. I define myself in relationship to you.
Society as a whole.
And
where do I fit into society?
Exactly.
So the second theme, identity, of course, is key. But the second theme they want to address is kind of the history of the movement towards ethnic studies. How did it arise and what's the background of it? How do we get to this point in finally addressing this need and neglect? Yeah,
and I think a lot of that comes out of segregation being in the very recent past. And sort of we acknowledge that segregation is a very recent past, one generation ago. And then we also acknowledge that in that integration process, in educational integration, we didn't really do, a close study of how do we integrate the text that we're reading? How do we integrate also this history that we're addressing? Like, how do we go from this moment of saying, like, only the presidents and big, the warriors of history are the ones who should be remembered and counted. And so that's also a shift of how we understand what's important to history more broadly. We've moved from a place where we say, and I think that's kind of tracking that same shift in history, in historical knowledge and historiography. Like, we've moved from saying, like, only the kings matter, right, to saying that we want to know about, the bakers. We want to know about the artisans. And so that's part of that same integration of saying, well, we want to know if, there were enslaved folks, 4 million enslaved folks in the nation, what sort of culture did they create? Because it wasn't part of the formal record, the formal culture in the US at the time. So ethnic studies is asking us to go back and say, not just for African Americans, that's often my frame of reference because that's my historical expertise or my academic expertise, but for all ethnic groups and identities. And how can we use that to understand, like, how are people always kind of moving towards this motion of being part of the same, again, going back to the idea of community.
And we should mention that the state mandate specifically is based on a high concentration in the ethnic studies itself of the 4 largely marginalized groups: African Americans, Latinos, Indigenous Americans, and Asian Americans.
Right.
And then they have the other groups, including Jewish Americans, that they're emphasizing they should also teach their ethnic background in your normal historical and geographic classes that you have. So they've tried to broaden it to cover all the marginalized groups with a special emphasis on these 4 groups within the ethnic studies curriculum. And that brings us to what I think will probably be the most controversial of the what they're calling the key themes. And they call the theme systems of power. So they want the curriculum that each school district develops to spend some time on systems of power.
Right.
I have a feeling that might be the one that draws the most controversy. What do you think about systems of power?
Yeah, I think, again, like, I'm always really, I invite people to think about these things with the widest range of empathy as possible. So even when I think of something like the Civil War, let's talk about slavery. Let's talk about the fact that there were slave owners in the US. And so how could you imagine that there is a person who could own other human beings, like punish other human beings violently, and then also be a great, leader in our nation? You have to acknowledge that those 2 things can happen at the same time. And there's a certain empathy that I think going into the study, it allows us to say, well, we don't have to ignore the fact that, George Washington had many slaves, or Thomas Jefferson, or, we don't have to ignore the fact that they didn't see that as in conflict. And it actually, in a lot of ways, to me, it invites us to look at our own culture and ask ourselves, what are we ignoring that in retrospect looks egregious? Like, nobody's on the side of slavery, but maybe there's something that we're not noticing that's happening right now that in 100 years or 200 years, people will look back on and shame us for that.
Because as this theme suggests, some of these things are embedded into the system, so we don't see them.
Right.
Just as you mentioned redlining, it was sort of an accepted practice, and nobody really questioned it.
Yeah.
Everybody said, well, we have to do that to protect property values.
Right.
And so the idea of systems of power is to point out exactly your point, that the systems of power themselves create a kind of invisibility.
Right.
So people don't even recognize the kinds of things that we hope historically we look back and say, boy, I'm glad we corrected that. I'm glad we are aware of it today.
Right. I mean, there's so many examples of that. There's so many examples of just these were not people who were evil. These are not people. These are cultural practices that were seen at the time as good and right and fair, and even benefiting those.
Even biblical.
Right. And I think there are all these ways that folks were seen to be, benefited by their condition of oppression. And so that was an argument for slavery for most of the time it was in the U.S., that this was pulling, savages out
of the
of
white man's burden.
Yeah, out of their, lack of culture and culturing them with the work ethic. And so I think that there are all these ways that we can think about systems of power, but the reality is it exists. I mean, we are in hierarchical systems right now, and there are systems that we're deferent to, whether it's a system of economic capitalism. If you have more money, you have more access to things, and we see that as right and fair and good. And nobody is necessarily, I think broadly culturally, obviously there are folks who are resisting that narrative, but I think broadly in the U.S. folks are pretty much like, if I have the money, I should be able to buy what I want and go where I want to go with it, Right. And so I think that that's a very similar system that we had, 100 years ago. And you could, it makes a lot of, it's not necessarily right, but it helps us to understand the issues that are happening right now. And that's really important.
And the last of the themes, systems of power, as I said, I think will be a little bit more controversial. Mm-hmm. But the last of the 4 themes in the mandate are what they call social movements and equity. Mm-hmm. So what do we see as social movements in the direction of greater equity, and what role does ethnic studies play in that movement?
I think ethnic studies is always trying to kind of complicate or trouble or give us a more complex or thorough understanding of a moment. So we already had, without this ethnic studies movement, we knew about the civil rights movement. Folks understand that there was this movement, and it was primarily a legal movement to desegregate spaces. And so we have these movements and cultures that were already part of our curriculum and understanding is the story that needs to be told. And I think one of the things that ethnic studies does is it expands the need for that, and it gives us context. Like, why would we have to march for desegregation in schools, right? So I think if we don't understand systems of power, kind of the point before that, then it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to say that we want integration or we see integration as a social good. And I think that's part of also what's so important to understand about ethnic studies and movements towards ethnic studies. It's not the idea of taking rights away from one group or, access away from one group and giving it to another group. It's about saying, how can we, work towards the good of all together? And I think that's what ethnic studies is trying to get at, and saying we're actually better off when we don't do those things. And you can see this. I feel like sports and, sports are a great example of this, because one of the first spaces of integration in the U.S. is sports and the military, because at the end of the day, they're not going to keep somebody out for long when they know that they can do the work and they need the work done. And so I think that that's one thing we see, where we could say we have these spaces where both, movement towards, ethnic studies and equity is really a movement towards hopefully the betterment of all.
Betterment of all, as a matter of fact, was summed up in one of the turning points in Brown versus the Board of Education, where the Supreme Court said that segregated schools are inherently unequal. Right. You don't have to really prove it. It's inherently unequal for everybody to have segregated schools. And this was all, I think, terrific detail, and we really appreciate all the experience that you bring to this discussion. So I think we should spend kind of our last conversational point on the role that ethnic studies plays and should play in strengthening democracy. Because that all of the other things feed into this main point that if we're going to live in an inclusive democratic society, we have to find ways to accomplish that. And the question is, how does ethnic studies help us do that?
I think ethnic studies asks us from just a baseline to bring voices to the fore that may not have been considered before. And that's what I think a centerpiece of democracy is: critical knowledge and understanding, right? Being able to talk to people, understand what the ideas are, in a lot of ways not be, really not be swayed by political leaders who are divisive and trying to attack and denigrate certain groups, there is a long legacy of that being kind of tamping down democracy.
Right.
So I think at the core, there is a desire to say, let's take a moment to listen to the voices we haven't heard before, but also, again, like I mentioned before, not have them in place of the other voices,
Correct.
but have them in dialogue and conversation. Because that's the reality of our world. Our world is inherently interconnected. There's no way to disconnect or separate, our cultures.
We're trying to complete the picture.
Right. And so it's like we either recognize it or we don't. Right. So it's already there. I feel like so much of ethnic studies is saying, this is the world we're already living in. So let's do some work to understand it a little better.
Well, that's a terrific way to end the conversation. And I want to say before we make a final comment, I want to just thank you once again for joining us. I know you have a very busy schedule, very impressive background, but I really appreciate your opening up with such a wonderful poem. It's a terrific way to set the stage for the discussion. Mm-hmm. The last point I want to leave, and I'll make the last comment on this session, is ethnic studies is here. Mm-hmm. It's a state mandate from California. And I think all of us here in Orange County, all throughout the state of California, we should take on ourselves the obligation to make sure that this ethnic studies program is rolled out in every school district in a proper, appropriate way, mm-hmm. proper to that school district, paying attention to the ideas behind the mandate, the key themes that we spoke about. There's a lot of other guidance in the legislation that's been developed, but I hope that everybody will play their role in helping us make this a stronger democracy by rolling out the ethnic studies mandate.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Me too. Thank you. Appreciate that.